What is going on, everybody? TJ with you for our first episode of Beyond the Tape for the 2026 NFL Draft Cycle. Been a minute since we had a Beyond the Tape, but excited to get into the 2026 NFL Draft class. Today, obviously, the best place to start, it's the conversation about the quarterback class. Is it better than last year? Who declares, who doesn't? And who do I have at number one? So excited to break down all these names. I do apologize. A little bit longer than I normally take. I've had a lot of, family trials and tribulations, you can say, over the last couple of months, a lot of travel and whatnot. But also I have banked up enough position groups and players watch that I think basically next week's going to be running backs, the week after that, receivers, the week after that, offensive line. And I'll probably sneak tight ends in there with wide receivers. So should have an episode of these, kind of early / preseason rankings out for you once a week moving forward. So again, barring any, crazy mishaps or things that come out of the blue. But with all that said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the 2026 quarterback class down below in the comments section. Without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting with quarterback number 10 for yours truly, Sawyer Robertson. All right, so this is the guy that I think I'm kind of keeping my eyes. I'm keeping my eyes on all these guys pretty closely, but he comes in at number 10, and I think there's a real possibility that Sawyer Robertson could shoot up the board. He makes me think of another quarterback that's a little bit higher, but one that's a redshirt sophomore, and I could totally see a world where that quarterback does not come out. But when talking about Sawyer Robertson, you see the height, weight, you see some of the stats there. Overall, really good athlete. He's a little bit of a slender build, 6'4", 220. I think he's probably a little bit closer to the 210 mark, and he does look a little slight with that, but all in all, really good arm to go with that athleticism. He comes from a good family of athletes. His cousin is Jarrett Stidham. His dad played for the Expos way back when. So a lot of athleticism running through those veins, and he makes a lot of tight window throws, specifically over the middle. That's something that always catches my eye. That's something that the best offenses at the NFL level, the next, best NFL offenses at the next level, they do that at a high level. So that's a trait that catches my eye every time I see it. Also has really good velocity when on the move. Sometimes guys get out on the move and they lose a little something on the fastball. Robertson, he's kind of that long, lanky build. He's got some long arms. It kind of just makes sense, almost baseball player-like. I don't know if he has a baseball background, but it is almost baseball player-like where he keeps that velo while still being on the move. And there was, I was watching the Iowa State game and, played a lot of zone coverage against him there. And I thought he was really patient. And you could tell Iowa State was playing zone, keeping eyes on him, didn't want his, rushing capability to come into play. 335 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns last year. That is a part of his skill set. And Iowa State felt like they were really trying to keep that under wraps. Because of that, though, he had to be really patient. And there were a lot of stick concepts throughout that contest. And just kind of waited, and just eventually a guy kind of sits and finds that soft spot, and he was able to deliver a throw. So I like seeing that patience. And you're talking about a guy who's a senior, so could be a Senior Bowl guy by the time we get through this upcoming season. And he shows a little bit of that, kind of veteran ability there. Not that he's got the most playing time under his belt per se. The big negative against Sawyer Robertson right now is he, like the other guy that he makes me think of, drifts too much. And, he's got a good arm, but just the harder he makes it, obviously the play starts to go a little bit sideways. And like I said, he's patient against zone coverage against Iowa State, but all in all, throughout everything I watched, I still think there's a little bit of development to be had there. I think he can read it out a little bit faster. And then the other thing that, I'd just be curious to hear if anybody else kind of felt like they noticed this. A lot of the times the deep ball placement, he has good touch throwing the ball down the field, but a lot of times it'll just drift left. He would always just miss a yard or so left. I don't know why. I don't know if he's opening up his hips a little too early. I don't know if he's opening up his shoulder. It's something that I'm going to keep an eye on once we get into the 2025 tape, because that's the other thing. Once we get into all these guys, preseason rankings are fun, but a lot of this changes really, really quick. So once we get the 2025 tape, I'm going to be curious to see, is that deep ball still missing left of the sideline? At least to the sideline, at least the play that comes to my mind against Iowa State late in that contest. That's a touchdown. He has the guy open. He's got to step on his defender, and he kind of just had it drift left on him. I don't know exactly why that is, but a little bit more refinement on that deep ball accuracy, cut back on the drifting, stand tall in the pocket, and if you can read out zone coverage just a little bit faster, there's something here with Sawyer Robertson. I can totally see where he shoots up my board. Also did want to note pressure to sack rate, nothing too alarming there. Time to throw could be a little bit better, 2.57, but that is going to be one of the lower numbers that we actually get today. So Sawyer Robertson, I think right now my quarterback 10, but wouldn't shock me whatsoever if he ended up moving up pretty quickly on the board. All right, let's get to my quarterback 9, John Mateer. And not to helmets out because this is Mateer's first year at OU, but he is kind of this interesting blend of Baker Mayfield mixed with like Kyler Murray. So he makes for a really fun player to watch. And also coming from Washington State, level of competition is not quite, on the same caliber. And now he's playing in the SEC. So I'm really interested to see what that looks like. Does he take a step forward? Sometimes these guys, it's a step up in comp, but they almost get better with it. I'm interested to see if Mateer does that. That said, you look at the 2024 tape and it's like this guy who should be probably playing in the SEC against, less than competition. It's a lot of fun. So real quick, everyone's like Baker mixed with Kyler. What does that mean? This guy is a really twitchy athlete. This guy is really elusive. 54 missed tackles last year. True dual threat quarterback here. And the other fun part about him that, shades of Kyler, again, with Kyler's kind of background. And the reason I say Baker is like he's got a good enough arm to push the ball down the field. And also, Baker last year, for whatever reason, felt like second half last season was just unafraid of putting his shoulder into someone. And Mateer has a little bit of that in his running style too. So for whatever reason, he makes me think of both those former OU quarterbacks. The other reason, again, to continue my point here, he makes me think of Kyler Murray and Murray's baseball background. Guy will throw from a ton of different arm angles, and he's got a pretty snappy release. Now, kind of on that, there's a little bit of a negative to that. He's listed at 6'1". Wouldn't shock me if he's 6 foot, maybe a inch or 1/8 of an inch or so below that. I can see where he's 5'11" and some change, maybe right at 6 foot. And he does throw sidearm to 3/4 a good bit. So at the SEC, and then furthermore, if we're talking about projecting into the next level at the NFL, what does that look like, right? Like 6'1's already one of those smaller frames. You're already worried about batted passes. And then once you start to lower that arm angle, it just becomes more and more likely that ball is going to get batted down at the line of scrimmage. So I first want to see what that looks like in the SEC. And then I'm really curious to see what projecting forward that may feel like at the next level. The negatives for Mateer, look, his offensive coordinator at Washington State, it's air raid scheme. It takes advantage of his rushing ability. It's a very good college offense. And now that offensive coordinator is going to OU, that's part of the reason Mateer is going to play for the Sooners as well. It's exciting on one point because we know it works, and it's a little frustrating on the other because, like with another guy that we are going to talk about, transferred from one school with a very college-friendly offense, now in a different situation. I'm excited to see what he looks like outside of that offense. Would have been nice to say the same here about John Mateer. What does he look like outside of this air raid, very college-like offense? Can he be more than just a one-read, tuck-and-run type of guy? Because at the end of the day, a lot of RPOs, a lot of option plays. Like it's one read, it's tuck and run for Mateer in that offense. It is going to be interesting to see how that translates to the SEC. Does it work on the same level that it did at Washington State? It was a really fun offense to watch. It's a lot of plays in one game also. So you're going to definitely get your work in. You're going to get a lot of reps before your eyes when you start watching these tapes. But that being said, what does it look like at OU? You do wish you could kind of expand what we're seeing on tape, but nevertheless, the step up in competition, even if it's the same offense, still gives us something new to learn. He's also a guy that when he's moved off his spot, not like Sawyer Robertson, right? But he's on the move. The fastball keeps that velo, and he can deliver a really nice ball on the move. Mateer, I think there is a little bit of a change in velo. I think he gets off his spot, and the arm isn't quite as live. I think he's got a pretty good arm. It's not elite. I don't even think it's as good as Baker Mayfield or anything like that. So that's kind of the struggle. I hate comps because some people will take that just as like definitive. It's not quite as good of an arm as Baker Mayfield. He's got a really good arm for someone who's 6 foot. But especially on the move, Mateer, I feel like does lose a little bit of that steam. Want to see if that is something I notice again this upcoming year at OU. And he is a one speed thrower on that note. Like if he's in the pocket, the throw for 5 yards from the line of scrimmage is the same from 15 yards out from the line of scrimmage. Like he is just going to pepper it in there. So there is definitely a little bit more nuance, a little bit more touch. Just needs that change up. Needs to know when to dial it back just a little bit, make it a little bit more, pass catcher friendly. And of course, the biggest, question mark here is like, what does it look like in the SEC? 826 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns, a rushing grade over 86 using PFF's data. Just looks like a more dynamic athlete than most of the people on that field. So then you get to the SEC, and is that going to be the same? On top of that, 25.8% pressure to sack rate, one of the higher numbers we're going to talk about today. If that was the case at Washington State, that number is potentially even more drastic and even more scary at the SEC. So can he get rid of the football? And then, of course, there's his athleticism and mobility and just kind of quick twitch you see at Washington State. Does that carry over at a higher level of competition? Really fun player to watch. I'm really, really in on this OU team. I'm not to spoil too much here. Big fan of Jade Knott. Big fan of Deion Burks. Like, this is going to be a really fun team to watch this upcoming season. All right, let's get on to my quarterback number 8, Fernando Mendoza. Cal transfer to Indiana, so that's on me for not updating that graphic. If you just stitch together his, best of throws, you feel like you're watching an NFL, potential first-round prospect, because the best of, like, really nice sideline accuracy. He can move well, has an NFL frame and an NFL arm. So you watch the best of moments, and you're like, okay, wow. The downside is, against pressure, I think the release gets a little wonky. Also, at Cal, I just think there was limited, especially last year where Jayden Knott's not at 100%. I just think there was a lot of limitations put on that offense and what all they could ask him to do. And because of that, you watch a ton of tight end screens. If you're excited about, if you're a Texas fan and you're wondering who Jack Endries is, I'm sure if you're a Texas fan, you're not wondering that. But one of the better tight end prospects in this year's class. And man, it felt like a never-ending amount of tight end screens within that Cal offense last year, because there's just not that much to play with for Mendoza. So, Endries was the guy, wanted to get the ball into space for him. And again, Jayden Knott was not at 100%. I wish I could have seen what that offense would have looked like, even with just one more weapon. And if Ott was at 100%, I think he would have been that weapon. But again, lot to like about Mendoza. NFL frame, NFL arm, sideline accuracy. He can throw over the middle of the field, has plenty of tight window throws. One of the other bugaboos for him, though, pressure to sack rate at 25.6%. On the flip side, time to throw, 2.59. Not too bad. And really that to me is just signals 2.59 time to throw. Some of that is screens that brings that number down. He took 40 sacks last year, and I think a lot of that is that Cal offensive line. And some of it is him. So, screenplays will bring, again, that time to throw down. I'm very interested to see at Indiana what his overall time to throw. It's going to be a little less screen heavy in that offense. And also, it's going to be a better offensive line in front of him. You could also make an argument it's going to be stiffer competition going from the ACC to the Big Ten. So really interested to see what we get out of Mendoza. And also, Curt Cignetti's just got an awesome track record of developing specifically transfer quarterbacks. And we saw that last year with Curtis Rourke. This guy who, won't he get drafted? Ultimately does get drafted on day 3, albeit, but he does get drafted to the San Francisco 49ers in a fit that's like, if Curtis Rourke were to work out at the NFL level as a 7th round pick, where would it be? It'd be somewhere in a Shanahan scheme. So there's something to be had there. And I think Mendoza has more natural talent and just he's a better overall athlete. So there's just more to be excited about with the Mendoza than there is with someone like our Curtis Rourke, who is a good, I think a future NFL backup quarterback. Mendoza, I think there's a higher ceiling in part because of that athleticism. So now he gets to go to Indiana, and it's one of the, there's probably 4, 5, 6 guys from Indiana that are going to get drafted this year. And I was literally just listening to Todd McShay's podcast. Apparently the last time they've had 3 or more guys get drafted was like 2022. So it's been a bit of a dry spell there from an NFL draft standpoint. And on top of that, not only does he have, a pretty good roster around him, he has Elijah Surratt, and that's going to be someone that ranks pretty high in my receiver rankings. So I think that's a great piece for Mendoza to rely on and lean on, and just better than really anything I thought he had at Cal. So again, the negatives: took 40 sacks. That's just too many. Also had 3 fumbles. You get sacked 40 times, the ball's eventually going to come out. And then the release gets a little weird against pressure. And I think that's just something that Curt Cignetti's going to be able to iron out. That to me is just kind of, again, I'm not trying to besmirch a program, but I think there's going to be a step up in coaching. And I think there's going to be a step up in overall talent in his environment this year going to Indiana.
Rookie. It's all about rookie talk in fantasy football right now. So why not go use all that knowledge to do something other than a mock draft? Chris Gimino won $8,000 with just 2 teams last year, and each draft took 5 minutes. That's pretty good ROI. You can start doing rookie drafts for money today on Fast Draft. The Origins tournament is live. It is the place to go and monetize your knowledge of rookies, and use your favorite player profiler host promo code for a $25 deposit match. Now let's go start drafting faster.
Quarterback number 7 is Nico Iamaleava, and he's a tricky one. So as you could probably catch on a little bit earlier, this is the guy I'm talking about where, Mateer, he's going to have the same scheme around him going from Washington State to OU, but at least we get to step up in competition to make it a little easier. Iamaleava is the one I was talking about on the other side, where it's like he left Tennessee, this very college-like, gimmicky, Josh Heupel, spread it out, so, 8 outs off the roof. Last year's 8 out was north of 11. They want to chuck the ball deep, and then they want to fill it in underneath with guys like Dylan Sampson and their speed. So That being said, we haven't seen Hendon Hooker. Jalen Hyatt hasn't worked out. Cedric Tillman, a couple of good games. It's just been a tough offense for the last few years to decipher the quarterback and receiver, projectability to the next level. So on one side, I'm excited to see Amaliava leave Tennessee and go to a different offense. The other side of it is like UCLA just been a little bit before I've seen the best of, specifically on the offensive side, the best of that program. So I hope they're not leaving meat on the bone by going to a program like UCLA. And I hope this is ultimately something that maybe turns that program around. Because Amaliava has undeniable talent. Like the arm, this guy's got plenty of it. Plenty of arm talent, both when it comes to just deep ball, pushing it down the field, but also zip. Like plant that back foot. He's got power throws at all three levels that make you go, whoa. This guy's arm looks like a high-end NFL starter. He's also a really fluid athlete. He's really good on the move. 215 pounds, at 6'6", he does have that slender build. You'd like to see him add maybe 5 to 10 pounds, but he also moves really well because of that. So arm strength, mobility, redshirt sophomore. There's a lot to like here. And there's a string of redshirt sophomores here coming up. So Amaliava being the first of that we're going to talk about here. Why is he, not higher on this? 6 fumbles last year. And the fact of the matter is he has all the arm talent in the world. But to this point, all I've seen him in is the Josh Heupel offense. And a lot of fun in college. But now he's going to this program where I have no idea where he fits in, the strength of this play caller, the pieces around him. It's a whole new world. And that's the other thing is like, yes, the offense at Tennessee is very gimmicky, but they also recruit at a very high level. That's a big name in the SEC, and there's a lot of highly talented prospects and high school recruits going there. So they have a ton of talent around you at all times. UCLA, I mean, maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but just hasn't been, blazing the recruiting trail from where I stand. So the situation around him, the coaching, the scheme, there's just a lot to be figured out. Yes, it might make for a little bit more of an NFL translatable, picture when we start watching this 2025 tape, but is it going to look as good? That's my concern. 6 fumbles last year. That's tough. The pressure to sack ratio, 25%, 120 pressures turning into 30 sacks. That's a number that's got to come down. And then you look at the time to throw. It's not disastrous, I wouldn't say. But it's just an area that, leaving that Josh Heupel offense, I do wonder overall what it's going to look like at the NFL level. So a lot that I'm very curious about when it comes to Nico Amaliava, because there's an abundance of talent. Time to throw, by the way, 2.95. I was just looking for the exact number. So I'd like to see that number come down to closer to 2.5 if we can make it. So, what does that look like at UCLA? I could see where there's more screenplays that kind of make that happen, but I just, it's tough. And I mean, again, Tennessee, they want to work vertical. They want the ball to go downfield. So change in scheme might lower that time to throw, but that plus the pressure to sack rate, they kind of scream younger prospect, redshirt sophomore. Maybe he needs one more year in college. And there's going to be a few guys where we're saying that up ahead with these redshirt sophomores. And of course, the guy number one, not to spoil too much here, but that guy could definitely go back to school as well. So, but I want to be fair. If I'm going to put one redshirt sophomore in here, all these guys who become draft eligible, I'm going to treat them as draft eligible until they say they're not coming out. So Amaliava comes in at my quarterback 7. Quarterback 6 is Sam Levitt. This is the guy who Sawyer Robertson very much so kind of makes me think of Sam Levitt. I think Levitt's just a little bit of a better version of what Sawyer Robertson could be. But that said, we could see where 2025 goes, right? Like Levitt, redshirt sophomore, this could be a year where they take a step back, even though he has Jordan Tyson, who not spoiled too much my receiver rankings, but he's been my number 1 draft eligible receiver. Would be shocked if I changed my mind between now and then. So he's got a great weapon there, but so much of that identity last year was Cam Scadaboo setting up Sam Levitt with play action opportunities. Who knows, in 2025, more weight on his shoulders, it could be a step back, and maybe he decides to go back to school. And in turn, teams who like Sam Levitt or are intrigued by him could see Sawyer Robertson as the more NFL-ready version of that similar player. Both a little bit slender build, 6'2", 200 here for Levitt. And he kind of has that same flaw where, like, there's some plays where it's like, Sam, where are you going? Why are you drifting so far back, buddy? You got a good arm, but why are you taxing yourself so much here? So there's just little things like that. I will start with the negatives here. Slider frame tends to fade off his back foot. Another one-speed thrower. I didn't say that with Robertson. I think there's a little bit more touch there. And it's not to say Levitt doesn't have touch, but I would say every throw up until 25 yards looks about the same. And then once he's pushing the ball down the field, he gets a little bit more touch on the deep ball. But, line of scrimmage through 20 yards, 25 yards out, it's pretty much one-speed throwing. which was more mature than Robertson, but nevertheless, you see some of these similar flaws. But all that said, he's a redshirt sophomore who I think the second half of last year continued to get better and better and better. Was really intrigued by what we saw to the Texas game, considering he didn't have Jordan Tyson. And a lot of that game is Cam Skattebo putting the team on his back and then setting up Sam Levitt. But he's a really nice athlete with a strong arm, and he's one of the best intermediate passers this class has. Sometimes a little late to see in open window, and sometimes he, during the year when they had Jordan Tyson, sometimes he's kind of leaving Tyson out to drive sometimes with those throws where he's a little late to see it. But first full season of starting, I think we can kind of give him a little bit of give him the benefit of the doubt there and say, hey, with more reps, more time, that's going to be something that gets cleaned up. Live arm, Todd McShay had said he kind of makes him think of J.J. McCarthy. I could see that. 502 rushing yards last year, 5 touchdowns. You see that athleticism. And again, a guy who's on the younger side. So if he declares for next year, you're talking about like him, no surprise here. Lenore Sellers going to be on this list. Arch Manning's on this list. And who we just talked about in Nico Maliava. Some of the conversation is going to be, they're just finished their redshirt sophomore year. So there's all this potential. I think that gets a little overblown, but like for your more casual draft fans, age does sometimes correlate to potential and what they think is still to be gained. The meat's still on the bone, if you will, for these prospects. And for Levitt, I think that's absolutely true. This is just going to be his second full season as a starter, but they have a really good program, really good head coach, and they have, to me, again, the best draft eligible receiver this year, who is fantastic and is the best draft eligible receiver in the country, working that 10 to 20 yard range. And that is an area where Levitt was good last year. Still think he can see it a little bit sooner, but I think that should be a pairing that lights it up for that Arizona State team. So there's a lot I like about Sam Levitt, but I also know like Alex at Hail Mary Sports, we're going to potentially be doing some future position rankings. Really excited to get Alex on the show here. I know he's a little bit lower on Levitt, and I could see a world where you look at last year and Cam Skattebo did a lot of the heavy lifting, and they put this kid in a lot of play action heavy spots where, defenses are forced to try to commit and slow down Cam Skattebo. And that's maybe why the intermediate passing is such a big strength of Levitt, because linebackers and safeties are cheating up and, they're throwing play action passes right behind it. So no Skattebo, really interested to see how that dynamic changes for Sam Levitt. But I think there's a lot of natural ability, both in his arm and his mobility. So definitely put me in the interested column. All right. Now let's get on to quarterback 5. And I feel like I'm going to upset a lot of people with this, because the hype train right now for Lenore Sellers is absolutely there. And no doubt has the potential to become quarterback 1. If Arch Manning goes back to school, and maybe even if he doesn't, if he does declare, there's still a world where like Lenore Sellers sets college football on fire and he's QB1. Like the ceiling for this kid is through the roof. Another one of these redshirt sophomores. So all that said, he could go back to school at the same time. Sellers is an absolutely electric athlete with some of the craziest escape plays that you'll see from a pocket. Like Dane Brugler tweeted out one against LT Overton. There's multiple in the Missouri game where you're like, okay, Cam Newton, how did you get out of that? And that's like, there is a lot of moments that make you think, holy cow, Cam Newton reincarnated. He's also got a pretty nice touch down the field. I think that really was something that I saw more and more as you watch his tape throughout the season. And again, the Missouri game is probably the game to watch. And you start to see that deep ball touch. Ball placement could be still a little bit better, but he's got the touch to make that very catchable ball, especially a receiver up against the sideline. So for this guy who is so young, you saw a ton of growth last year. And that's kind of maybe the biggest selling point here for Lenore Sellers is like the ODU season opener. It looks like a 19-year-old who's, first full season as a starter up ahead. Okay, yeah. And it's not to say that ODU game was all bad, but South Carolina, ODU, and when it comes to strength of programs. So that was a start. And the first couple of games, I'd say first 4 games of last year, you're like, okay, you're kind of waiting for it to fully form. And then you get about midway through the season, and he still holds on the ball a good bit. The pressure to sack rate's not as insane. It's sub 20%. It's at 19.1%. But a lot of that is his own escapability. But you start to see the ball come out a little bit quicker. You start to see the ball placement get a little bit better. You start to see more of that touch deep down the field. And now the question is that going to carry into next season? It's great to see that over the course of a year. But now we're going to go into 2025, and every team that plays South Carolina has a better idea about Lenore Sellers than they did a year ago. Even in the teams that played him in the back half of last year. Now, like if Missouri sees him again, they have much more film and a much better idea of who LaNorris Sellers is. So yes, he made some huge strides last year in regards to his consistency as a passer, and then you have the flash plays with his athleticism. That's great. He still holds onto the ball way too long, and he has the highest time to throw of anybody here, 3.3 seconds. That is something that's going to have to change. And this is a South Carolina team that threw not the most amount of screens that I watched of any of these teams on tape, but there's a good chunk of screens running that offense. So still a time to throw at 3.3. Whew, that can be a lot. And I still think, and part of the reason the time to throw is so high, there is still work to be done when it comes to reading zone defenses. I said that about Sawyer Robertson. Sawyer Robertson's a senior. I think he can still speed it up. LaNorris Sellers got one full season of starting. So zone defenses, I think, still puzzle him a little bit. Again, got a little bit quicker as the year went on, but still there is room for him to grow. And I still think his feet and his base from which he throws needs more consistency. Right now, he can make some crazy off-platform throws. I think this guy just really has really strong body control. And also even if base isn't clean, he can still make some throws where that's not how it's supposed to look. But I mean, the result works. That being said, I'd like to see this year that get cleaned up, a little bit more consistency, especially as he's throwing on the move. I'd like to see a nice solid base for him to throw with, because you can get away with it sometimes if you can have a solid base and he can make that a consistent thing that we can expect to the next level. Then we're talking about this guy who has a big arm, and if he grows as a passer, reads zone defenses, okay, now you're worried about him inside the pocket. Plus what he can do as a design runner, and God forbid, if you let this guy get outside the pocket and everything goes off script, he's a threat with his legs, and he could potentially be a threat with his arm if he can find more consistency throwing with a solid base on the move. So, and he also has to limit the fumbles. And part of that is, 674 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns. They tap into him as a design runner. He's a big, scrambling is a big part of his game. But he's got to hold on to the football. So, really fun prospect. And the highs absolutely scream like quarterback one. But I'm just not fully ready to jump on that bandwagon. Again, preseason rankings, I'm not fully on board with jumping onto the hype train of any of these guys. Yes, you can project it forward, but right now, I think he's about the 5th best quarterback, and there's definitely, I'll be the first one to do it. If we get 6 weeks into the year and he's reading out defenses faster, the ball's coming out sooner, the deep ball accuracy looks like something that can be translated to the next level, and he's consistently doing it week over week, then he'll pretty quickly be QB2. If you're just going off potential, you could sell me on him being QB2 in my rankings for sure. But I just got 1 year worth of tape right now. And I just want to see, it's nice when you have in-season progress. Can you carry it over to the next season? Some guys do, some guys don't. So I'm really interested to see what happens with LaNorris Sellers this year. But no doubt, # fun to watch through and through. All right, let's get on to my quarterback 4. That's going to be Drew Aller. And if you followed me throughout last draft cycle, will he, won't he, Drew Aller come out? I was intrigued with him last year as a prospect, also a little bit of a weaker quarterback class. But now getting to watch him against these 2025 quarterbacks, it has changed my thoughts on him a little bit, specifically dealing with how athletic maybe he is. Last year watching against Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, these guys who aren't all-world athletes, he looks like, okay, there's something there. He's a pretty good athlete for someone who's 6'5", almost 240 pounds. Okay, pretty good mobility. And then you start watching, and this isn't always fair, but then I'm coming off watching Sawyer Robertson, who's a pretty good athlete, watching his tape, and Sam Levitt can move, and LaNorris Sellers is a freak, and then a guy who's at number 1, and even the guy who's one spot ahead of Drew Aller. Oh God, these guys move all really well and better than Aller for sure. So I think that's changed my tune a little bit, where I thought, I never thought he'd be like Justin Herbert level of athletic, but I was like, maybe he's like a step down below that. That's still pretty good for someone his size. And now I think ultimately he's a coordinated athlete, but I don't think he's a super explosive athlete, and he's kind of more Big Ben in that regard, where Big Ben could climb the pocket and he could throw dudes off, and he was like a coordinated athlete, but he wasn't, blowing you away, in a sprint. So that is one of the things I just wanted to address off top. Maybe if you watched the 2024 draft lead up, where I felt about Aller versus where some of those things have changed for me going into the 2025 season. Let's continue to roll with the negatives. Again, coordinated athlete. I don't think he's explosive. That's, one part I like that he's coordinated. Wish he was a little bit more explosive, especially in this class where there's a ton of guys who move really well. Ball placement and footwork still need more consistency. I will say, if you watch 2023 Aller versus 24, it already looks leaps and bounds better. And I have full faith and confidence in Andy Kotelnicki. He's, to me, one of the best offensive coordinators in college football. I think that's a guy to continue to work with Aller on stuff like that. So I'm expecting a similar jump for it this year. That being said, if we don't get that, the range of outcomes for Aller could be like he could get comped to Justin Herbert or Big Ben, or if that footwork and ball placement doesn't get cleaned up and take another step forward, he could be Christian Hackenberg 2.0. So like the range of outcomes here for Drew Aller, and I think he's still better than Hackenberg, but I'm just saying the range of outcomes for where people are going to feel about him after this season are pretty insane. So it's really hard to gauge right now. So him and Sellers, I'm both kind of hedging, professional fence sitter here. I'm going to put him right now smack dab in the middle of my rankings. I love the upside. And again, you could sell me on Sellers, being up above Aller, but at least Aller I've seen year over year growth. Sellers I've seen in-season growth. Year to year, to me, that bodes really, really well to me. And also I saw Aller get better over the course of last year. I know the Notre Dame game kind of put this, an ugly slide on that, especially in the last, quarter that he played in that game with a couple of costly turnovers. But that being said, over the course, West Virginia through the end of the season, I think Aller did get better, but we also saw him get better 23-24. So that's part of the reason he gets the nudge over Sellers. But Sellers is a way more dynamic athlete, no doubt about it. They both have killer arm strength. But right now, I do think Aller, while I do think the ball placement can get a little bit better, I do think he's a slightly more accurate passer right now than Sellers. I also think he's got a really interesting situation in regards to like the Notre Dame game. His receivers had 0 targets for 0 catches that game against Notre Dame, who ran man coverage pretty much play in and play out. Now they got 3 transfer receivers. So yes, no Tyler Warren there for Drew Aller, but he's got 3 transfer receivers, including Deuce Robinson, who had a contested catch rate over 56% last year at USC. And they had a pretty deep rotation of receivers. Really excited to talk about some of those guys once we get to the receiver episode. So like him, and then Pena and the kid from Troy, whose name's now escaping me, of course. But like this is a whole new receiver core. And because of that, like you look at Aller, he's really confident when he can see the number on the front of the jersey. If you're facing him and working between the hashes, Aller's going to hit those guys with confidence. But against Notre Dame, wasn't a clean window. And I don't think Aller had the confidence to throw those guys outside the hashes, because that just takes more timing and more trust. And I just don't think Aller fully trusted those guys, to be honest. So this is a huge year. Can we see more of those throws outside the hashes? Can we see this for someone with a big arm? The deep ball accuracy really isn't anything that's like, whoa, holy cow. A lot of the deep ball stuff that you see is like, oh, there's Tyler Warren, he's wide open. Or like, oh, Tyler Warren made that 15-yard catch and now he's gone. So I want to see what the receiver dynamic, can he hit that 60-yard bomb in tight window and hit Deuce Robinson on the sideline? So like little things like that, I still need to see. But real quick to get over, some of the positives here. He's got a great frame. Obviously got a super live arm. Like frame and arm look like NFL caliber. And he's a coordinated athlete, like I said. And we did see that growth with Andy Kotelnicki. And I'm hoping that continues into 2025. And especially with these new receivers, I think there's going to be a lot more NFL translatability in that offense now. I will say he's one of these guys that like, why didn't you go to the Mania camp? Felt like that could have been something that boosted, his, I don't know, view with the league, because there are scouts there, but also just would have been nice to see him in a situation like that. But not that I was down there to fully scout it, but sometimes when guys don't go to that and you're expected to be a, potential first round pick next year, that always just kind of perks my ears and becomes something I want to ask people about. So that's going to be a little bit of homework I have in the future, but still optimistic about Aller. Really like the arm strength. And if we get a similar jump that we saw from 23 to 24, we get that in 25. I think this guy is a first rounder, absolutely through and through. All right, let's leave that and let's go to Cade Klubnik. He's going to be my quarterback 3. And that's just where I think there's a higher ceiling for Aller, but the floor at the same time is a lot lower than Klubnik. Klubnik in a lot of ways does make me think of Bo Nix, 6'2", 210, not the biggest. I think honestly Klubnik probably closer to 200. Him and Sam Levitt, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference in how much weight they're carrying. So I think he's a little bit thinner maybe even than Bo Nix, because Bo Nix is pretty evenly, stoutly built from top to bottom. But that being said, Cade Klubnik's a guy, and I'll admit it fully. 2 years ago, I was out on Klubnik. I was like, yeah, I just don't see a future NFL quarterback. And I definitely carried over some of that animosity into the beginning of last year. And then I think about maybe the Wake Forest game, there was something that flipped for Cade Klubnik. And maybe it was just the amount of reps that he's had, the amount of in-game snaps, the amount of games played maybe even, or something changed. The processing speed got better. I thought his decision to throw versus when to run got that much more crisp. And then kind of even on that, This guy moves really well, both in the designed run game, 588 rushing yards last year, 7 rushing touchdowns, but also behind the line of scrimmage. And maybe that was the big thing that changed in my eyes. The ability to create off script added something that I just don't think this Clemson offense had while Klubnik was that first year starter. And the first 4 or 5 games last year weren't the best, especially against like good competition. Maybe that was the thing that changed. And because of that off script ability, he just kept defenses that much more honest. I think he's got really nice underneath and intermediate accuracy. I think he can push the ball down the field with good touch. I don't think he has that strong of an arm, though. And that's part of the reason. And Bo Nix, to me, has a stronger arm than Klubnik. But that's kind of where my limitations are, and that's why I can't put him any higher than really 3 right now. Does a lot of things well, though. Gets rid of the ball in a timely manner, 2.64 time to throw, and I think that could get even better. Pressure to sack rate, only at 15%. That's a rock solid number. Plus what you get out of him as the designed runner. And then that underneath to intermediate accuracy, I think somebody could look at him and say, hey, he may not be a world beater, but I'm this great play caller, and this is a guy I can work with. Like, again, if Bo Nix wasn't in Denver, I could see a world where like Sean Payton's like, I can work with this as long as he delivers the ball on a consistent and accurate basis. So I could definitely see where the right OC is looking at him like, that's all I need. The negatives, there's really not too many. It's just not ideal arm strength, and it's not ideal frame. But if you're willing to give up a little bit of that for someone who's now going to have another year of starting experience inside a Power 4 conference, good mobility, and what that might bring on, dual threat quarterbacks can just open up so much for your rushing game. And really that, even look at like Justin Fields, who we're still talking about, like, can he grow as a passer? Can he grow as a passer? He kind of sometimes creates open windows just because of how good of a runner he is. And because he has to, teams have to contain, or they'll have to put a spy out there taking a guy out of, zone coverage or, even man-to-man with that spy. So I think Klubnik does bring some of that, and that kind of offsets a little bit of that. But again, I just don't think the deep ball or anything like that is going to wow you. So I could see him being this high floor, but I do think the ceiling's a little bit limited with Klubnik. But like I said, I came into with some animosity into 2024. And, once you get in the back half of that season's tape, I'm happy that he changed my mind. And, I'd love to see in 2025 where he's just pushing the ball down the field. Arm looks way more alive. And maybe he goes to the Senior Bowl too, and I get to see it in person. That kind of changes things too. Lot to be still had here with Cade Klubnik. So fun prospect who's changed a lot in my eyes, but nevertheless, I still do wonder about the ceiling. And that's part of the reason why I'm a quarterback 2. Garrett Nussmeier, he makes me think of Tony Romo plus arm strength in a lot of ways. Which is kind of a fun player to talk about, because Romo had a little bit of that gunslinger, but sometimes his arm just wasn't quite enough to make it happen. But Nussmeier, man, you don't have to watch much to see, like, there is not many throws this guy doesn't have the confidence to make. Like, this guy wants to let it rip. Sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst. Sometimes it's perfect timing and touch. And it's like, sheesh, the fact that first year starting last year at LSU, you have all the confidence in the world to make that throw. Like the game winner against Ole Miss, you're just like, holy cow. Okay, we got something here. And his eyes are always downfield. And he's big play hunting when he's, off on the move and he's outside the pocket. He's looking for that big play. Also want to shout out, only took 15 sacks. There's some plays where it's like, okay, he's big play hunting a little bit too much, but he did a really good job limiting how much that play could potentially hurt that offense. That's something that, his dad's the offensive coordinator at for the New Orleans Saints. Some things like that, like a low pressure to sack rate, and like only took 15 sacks despite sometimes maybe he holds on the ball and tries to create a little too much. That to me just screams like, yeah, I could see where his, OC father is like, can't fall behind the chains. You got to get rid of the football. No sacks, no sacks, no sacks. And some of that also kind of ties into the timing and touch. You can just tell where the anticipation, is just there a little bit more with Nussmeier than guys normally are. That being said, the negatives are sometimes he takes that gunslinger mentality a bridge too far, and he's just making and sometimes he's just not even on the same page. Like the interception against South Carolina. Honestly, I don't know what he was looking at there, but he just has too much confidence maybe. And I want a guy to have confidence, but sometimes it's just confidence and you're a first-year starter, and it's like, oof, okay, don't know what that was. So I think a lot of that will get ironed out, and now a second year as the starter. And that's the other real negative I have here is like 1 year worth of starting, and it's a mixed bag for sure. Does it get better in year 2? Or is that another year of year 2 mixed bag? Because if it's year 2 mixed bag, I could see a world where I end up having Klubnik ahead of him just because, hey, higher floor, greater probability of this guy becoming a pretty good NFL starter. But if we see that gunslinger mentality dialed in just a little bit, and he knows when to take those chances versus when not to, I think we got a guy who should go top half the first round because I think the arm strength's there. I think he moves really well. 6'2", 210, kind of your modern prototypical quarterback size. Doesn't hold on to the ball too long. And then the wow throws are definitely something that could get you excited and get you pumped up for what his NFL, prospects look like. And I can see a world where, an NFL play caller, head coach, whoever it may be, watches those throws and say, man, just with a few more reps with my coaching, we could take this to an even higher high. So I like Garrett Nussmeier a little bit more than Cade Klubnik, but I'd be curious to hear people's approach. I think Nussmeier has a higher ceiling, and that's kind of why I'm opting a little bit in this direction. And then finally, at number 1, no surprise here, it is Arch Manning. I understand everyone's expecting him to come out in the 2027 draft. I think that's certainly plausible when you look at what Peyton and Eli did. But let's be honest, it's not the same college football landscape that it was when Peyton and Eli played. In fact, the matter is, I had Nico Maliava, redshirt sophomore who could go back to school on this list. I had Lenore Sellers, redshirt sophomore who could go back to school. Sam Levitt, redshirt sophomore who could go back to school. If I put them on this list, why wouldn't I put Arch, who, to me, comfortably the best quarterback in this class already? The main drawback is he just needs more reps. Pulling it up, 90 attempts last year. 90 attempts. It's a small sample size, so this year it's going to be paramount. And I can see a world where he wants a second full season as a starter. But even on 90 attempts, you see a nice athlete who's definitely more athletic than Peyton and Eli. You see good decision-making, when to tuck and run, when to abandon the pocket, when to stand tall in the pocket, willingness to take on contact as a runner, very good downfield touch. And Sark, a lot of passes to the running backs, and there's a couple of dimes, a couple of beauty, just pearls dropped into a basket from Arch to those running backs deep down the field. And it's just doesn't even have a full season of, starting under his belt. And that's the type of in-game touch this guy's got. It's just next level stuff here. Accurate passer throwing from multiple arm slots. Really good velocity. Can plant that back foot and make those power throws. But also stays patient. So he's got a lot of those traits and stuff that makes you go, wow, about Nussmeier, but he also doesn't force it. The cons, it's not many. Sometimes he's a bit robotic. Just looks like a guy who's got, 90 attempts under his belt, still trying to feel out how to make it look a little bit smoother. And, especially when you're trying to get into, play action or, screen, you're trying to give a little bit of deception towards the defense, whether it's play action and you're going to go pass or you're handing it off and you're trying to fake the pass. There's some times where it just looks a little too robotic, a little bit too much like practice to me to buy in and say, okay, that's, a fake or even a defender for that matter. And then again, 90 attempts. So just needs more reps. Just need to see it on a more consistent basis. But if you extrapolated what we saw on those 90 attempts over the course of a full season, unquestionably he's the number 1 pick. That's just where we're at right now. That being said, it's not always that easy. You can't always just take a small sample size, blow it up 10x, and say, boom, there it is. Done. Easy peasy. So it's not always that simple. But if I had to put a guy number 1 overall in a way too early mock, which eventually we will do an early, / preseason 2026 mock draft, he'd be the guy I have at number 1. So love the mobility, love the arm. And again, the only reason we're not talking about him in this class is because we just assume because of his uncles. It's a different college football landscape. In fact, the matter is I have other redshirt sophomores on here. So I'm treating all these draft eligible players as just that, draft eligible. I'll let them make that decision in January, whether they do or they don't. So Arch Manning comes in at number 1 real quick. I'll give you 10 up to 1. Again, apologies for a couple of graphics mishaps, but I will make sure those are cleaned up by the time we get to running backs. Quarterback number 10, Sawyer Robertson. Quarterback number 9, John Mateer. Quarterback number 8, Fernando Mendoza. QB number 7 is Nico Maliava of UCLA. Number 6 is Sam Levitt of Arizona State. QB 5 is Lenore Sellers, definitely someone who can move up the board. He's the quarterback at South Carolina. QB 4, Drew Allar from Penn State. QB 3, I like the floor of Cade Klubnik. He's firmly right there. Can't see a world where he's outside my top 4 by the end of this year. He's the quarterback at Clemson. Garrett Nussmeier of LSU, second year starting there. He's my quarterback too. And then the prodigy. Arch Manning comes in at number 1. And if anybody's curious, who would number 11 be? I think it'd be Aiden Giles from Michigan State. I am very curious to see what he looks like. A really nice athlete, pretty strong arm, just a little bit boom bust. I think he takes hold on the ball a little bit too long, takes some sacks, and there's still some decision making that needs to be cleaned up. But another one of these guys with a super high potential. So I'd probably have Aiden Giles from Michigan State as my quarterback 11. But Guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section. Who's too high on my rankings? Who's too low? Or if you just want to jot me down your, top 10 coming into the season, I would love to hear it down below in the comment section, or reply back to this if you're watching on X. Also, give me a follow on X at TJ Wingert. My last name is spelled Wengert. And of course, if you're watching on X, be sure to give 32 Beat Writers a follow. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel. A lot more draft content. Again, I should have running backs out next week. And then we also have Z with all of his fantasy updates, plus our Beyond the Beat interviews with, we've already got a video with a Bills beat writer, Chiefs beat writer up. I just did one with Matt Collier from the covering the Minnesota Vikings. Did one with Nick Faribault covering the Pittsburgh Steelers. So a lot of content covering a lot of different bases, fantasy, NFL draft, the league as a whole. So plenty of content here on this 32 Beat Writers YouTube channel. Hope you can subscribe and hope you check out those videos. I'm going to get out of here before I talk too much longer. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, we are signing off.